The rusted metal screamed as the lock gave way, revealing not just darkness, but the weight of a forgotten promise worth millions. It was a secret the earth itself had kept, waiting for a hand desperate enough to dig. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The final, shuddering gasp of the old sedan's engine was the only sound in the quiet country lane. Alara's hands, chapped and pale, remained clenched on the steering wheel long after the silence descended. Beside her, 7-year-old Leo stirred from a light, fretful sleep, his small face smudged with dirt and the faint, silvery tracks of dried tears. In the back, Buster, their light brown Labrador, let out a low whine, his tail thumping a nervous, hollow rhythm against a pile of bundled blankets that held everything they owned. This was it. The end of the road, both literally and figuratively. The gas tank was empty. Their last few dollars had gone to a half-eaten bag of groceries 2 towns ago, and the hope that had propelled them forward for weeks had finally sputtered out along with the engine. For a month, they had been ghosts haunting the backroads, sleeping in the cramped confines of the car, the scent of stale fear and unwashed bodies clinging to the upholstery. Alara's job had vanished overnight, a casualty of a corporate merger she never saw coming, and their small apartment had followed soon after. Now, homelessness was not a concept, it was a crushing, physical weight. It was the ache in her bones from another night spent folded into the driver's seat, the gnawing emptiness in her stomach she ignored so Leo could eat the last of the bread, the shame that burned hot in her chest whenever they had to use a gas station bathroom to wash. She looked out the window at the landscape that had swallowed them. An orchard, vast and neglected, stretched away from the road. The trees were gnarled and ancient, their branches twisted into arthritic claws, yet they were heavy with apples, a riot of crimson and gold that no one had ever come to pick. They littered the ground in a thick, fermenting carpet. Their sweet, cidery sent a strange perfume for such profound decay. And there, set deep within the heart of the tangled trees, stood a house. It was more a skeleton than a structure, a shattered silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. Its roof sagged, its windows were vacant, hollow eyes, and its porch tilted at a drunken angle, surrendering to the weeds that clawed at its foundation. It was a place of profound loneliness, a forgotten memory left to rot. And in that moment, it felt like a mirror to her own soul. An idea, wild and desperate, sparked in the barren landscape of her mind. It was a foolish, reckless flicker of a thought born of absolute despair. She had $25 left in the world, a single bill tucked deep in her pocket, saved for an emergency that was now undeniably upon them. She turned to Leo, forcing a smile that felt brittle and strange on her face. "How about we go exploring, sweet boy?" Leo's eyes, wide and weary, brightened with a flicker of childish curiosity. Buster, sensing the shift in mood, pushed his wet nose between the front seats, his tail giving a hopeful wag. The next morning, they walked into the nearest town, a sleepy collection of buildings that seemed to be fading at the edges. The county clerk's office was a dusty, sun-bleached room that smelled of old paper and stale coffee. The man behind the counter was thick-set and balding, with a face that had settled into a permanent expression of weary indifference. When Alara, her voice trembling slightly, inquired about the abandoned orchard property, he barely looked up from his newspaper. "The old Blackwood place?" he grunted, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Been abandoned for decades. Since the 1980s, I reckon. Nothing but a tax burden. The family line died out, and the state's been trying to offload it for years. It's a tear down, a total loss." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. "Is it for sale?" The man finally lowered his paper, peering at her over his spectacles with a look that mingled pity and contempt. He took in her worn clothes, the desperate hope in her eyes, and a small, cruel smile touched his lips. "Lady, everything's for sale for the right price. But that place? The land's probably sour. The house is full of black mold and who knows what else. It had cost a fortune just to clear it." "How much?" she whispered, her throat tight. He seemed to consider it, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. He was probably thinking of a number that would crush her, that would send her scurrying back to whatever hole she'd crawled out of. He was about to name a price in the thousands. She could see it in the way he puffed out his chest. But then he stopped, his gaze drifting past her to where Leo stood by the door, his small hand clutching the leash of their big, friendly-looking dog. The man's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Maybe he had a kid of his own, or maybe just a shred of forgotten decency stirred within him. He sighed, a long, rattling sound. You know what? The paperwork to keep it on the books costs the county more than it's worth. You give me $25 for the processing fee and it's yours. Sold as is, where is, no guarantees, no refunds. He said it like a joke, a dare. He didn't expect her to have it. Alara's hand dove into her pocket, her fingers closing around the worn, folded bill. She pulled it out and laid it flat on the counter. The man stared at the $25, then back at her face. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. For a long moment he just stood there. Then, with a slow shake of his head, he reached for a stack of forms, the pen scratching loudly in the silent room as he signed away the deed to a shattered house and a forgotten orchard. Walking back to the property felt different. It was no longer just a place of decay. It was theirs. The single, flimsy piece of paper in Alara's pocket felt heavier than a bar of gold. It was a deed, a title, a claim. It was a root, however fragile, in a world that had cast them adrift. They pushed through the overgrown path, the weeds and thorny bushes catching at their clothes. The air was thick with the buzz of insects and the scent of rotting apples, but now it smelled less of decay and more of possibility. Buster bounded ahead, his tail held high, his paws scattering the fallen leaves. Leo, his earlier weariness forgotten, ran after him, his laughter echoing through the silent trees. The house loomed larger as they approached, more dilapidated than Alara had remembered. Up close, she could see the peeling paint, the splintered wood of the porch steps, the dark, gaping maw of the open doorway. It was daunting, a ruin that whispered of storms and neglect. But it was their ruin. "It's a castle, Mom," Leo breathed, his eyes wide with a child's boundless imagination. He saw not a wreck, but an adventure. Alara knelt and hugged him tight, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. "Yes, it is, baby. Our castle." They spent the next hour exploring the immediate surroundings, their spirits lifting with every small discovery. A bird's nest tucked in the eaves of the porch roof. A patch of surprisingly resilient wildflowers growing by the crumbling foundation. The gnarled, ancient apple trees themselves, which, despite their age, were still producing fruit. Alara picked one, a deep, glossy red, and polished it on her shirt. She took a bite, and the flesh was crisp and startlingly sweet, a burst of life in the midst of so much decay. She gave a piece to Leo, and his face lit up. It was the first fresh thing they had eaten in days. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower, casting long, distorted shadows through the orchard, they found themselves on the sagging front porch. Alara sat on the top step, the wood groaning in protest, while Leo chased a butterfly nearby. Buster, who had been sniffing intently around the base of the porch, suddenly began to dig. Not a playful, lazy scrape, but a frantic, determined excavation, his powerful front paws sending clumps of dark, damp soil flying. "Buster, no. Stop that," Alara called out, her voice tired. The last thing she needed was the dog digging up some dead animal or disturbing a nest of snakes. But Buster ignored her, a low growl of concentration rumbling in his chest. He was fixated, his entire being focused on the spot just beneath the lowest porch step. Leo came over, his curiosity piqued. "What's he doing, Mom?" "I don't know, sweetie. He's just being a silly dog." But he wasn't being silly. There was an urgency to his work that was unsettling. He dug deeper, his nose now buried in the growing hole, whining with excitement. Alara sighed and got to her feet, walking over to pull him away. As she reached for his collar, she saw it. Just for a second, as his paws cleared away another layer of dirt, she saw a dark, straight edge of something that was not rock or root. A flicker of intrigue pierced her exhaustion. Okay, boy, let's see what you're so excited about. She knelt in the cool earth, the smell of soil and worms filling her senses. Leo knelt beside her, his small hands mimicking hers as they began to scoop away the dirt. The soil was soft and loamy, easy to move. A few inches down, their fingers brushed against something hard, flat, and cold. It was metal. A surge of adrenaline, sharp and electric, shot through Alara. Together, they worked faster, their hands scraping and digging, the hole widening until they had uncovered the top of a box. It was a chest, about 2 feet long and a foot wide, made of dark, rusted metal, bound with pitted iron straps. It was heavy, solidly embedded in the earth, as if it had been sleeping there for a very long time. The thick, corroded lock held it shut. Their hearts pounded in unison, a frantic drumbeat of disbelief and wild, soaring hope. A treasure chest. It was the stuff of children's stories, of pirate maps and fairy tales. Couldn't be real, but it was. It was solid and real beneath their trembling fingers. It took both of them, grunting with effort, to work the chest loose from the earth's grip. They dragged it up onto the porch, the metal scraping against the weathered wood. Buster danced around them, barking excitedly, as if to say, "I told you so." For a moment, they just stared at it, breathing heavily. The lock was a solid mass of rust. It wouldn't budge. Alara looked around, her eyes scanning the debris on the porch. She found a heavy, rusted old tire iron lying near a pile of rotted planks. It was heavy in her hand, a tool for breaking things open. She wedged the tip of the tire iron into the space between the lid and the body of the chest, right next to the lock. She put all of her weight on it, her muscles straining. The metal groaned, a high, tortured sound. Leo watched, his breath held, his eyes like saucers. "Push, Mom, push," he urged, his voice a hoarse whisper. With a final, desperate heave, she threw her entire body into the effort. There was a loud, violent crack as the rusted hasp shattered and the lock broke away, falling to the porch with a dull thud. The lid, released from its long imprisonment, sprang open an inch. Silence. The only sound was the wind whispering through the apple trees and the frantic beating of Alara's own heart. With a hand that shook so badly she could barely control it, she reached out and slowly, hesitantly, lifted the lid. The interior of the chest was lined with what looked like oilcloth, dry and cracked with age. And nestled inside, protected from the damp earth, was not gold or jewels. It was paper, stacks of it. Thick, creamy, vellum, like paper, tied with faded silk ribbons. On top lay a series of large, folded documents, each one sealed with a dollop of dark red wax, stamped with an intricate crest. Alara lifted one out. It was surprisingly heavy. Her fingers traced the elegant, looping script of the handwriting. She couldn't make out all the words, but she saw enough. Deed of trust, estate holdings, property titles. Beneath these were leather-bound ledgers, their pages filled with columns of numbers and names. She carefully opened one of the folded documents, her fingers fumbling with the brittle wax seal. The paper crackled in protest as she unfolded it. It was a stock certificate for a railroad company she had never heard of, dated 1922. There were hundreds of them. It was a portfolio of a life, a dynasty of wealth, buried and forgotten. She didn't understand the legal jargon, the complex financial terms, but she understood the weight of what she was holding. This was not just a box of old papers. It was a fortune that had been sleeping in the dirt while she and her son had been starving in a car just a few hundred feet away. She picked up another document, a summary of estate assets from a law firm, dated 1979. Her eyes scanned the columns of figures, and her breath caught in her throat. The numbers were staggering, incomprehensible. Her gaze fell on the final tally at the bottom of the page, a number that seemed to leap out at her, to burn itself into her brain. Total estimated value, $15.5 million. $15.5 million. The words had no meaning. They were an abstraction, a fantasy. She looked at the $25 receipt in her pocket, then back at the impossible number on the page. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she sat down hard on the dusty porch, the documents clutched to her chest, the setting sun turning the shattered windows of her new home to glittering gold. The world tilted, a dizzying, nauseating slide into unreality. Alara's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, each one a painful effort. The number on the page was a brand, seared into her vision, a string of words that felt alien in her mind, $15.5 million. It was a sum so vast, so utterly disconnected from the gritty reality of her life, that it felt like a cruel joke. She stared at her hands, the dirt caked under her fingernails, the skin raw and chapped from work and worry, and tried to connect them to the person who was supposedly holding a fortune. The disconnect was a physical chasm. The sun, now a fiery sliver on the horizon, bled light across the orchard, painting the gnarled trees in hues of orange and violet. The beauty of it was sharp, almost painful, a stark contrast to the turmoil churning inside her. Leo, who had been watching her with wide, concerned eyes, crept closer. He didn't understand the papers, the numbers, the sudden, crushing silence that had fallen over his mother. He only understood the tremor in her hands, the strange, vacant look in her eyes. He laid his small, grubby hand on her arm. "Mom, are you okay?" His voice, small and clear, was an anchor in the swirling vortex of her thoughts. Pulled her back from the edge of the abyss. She looked at him, really looked at him, at his smudged cheek, his worn, too short jeans, the unwavering trust in his gaze. This was real. He was real. The gnawing hunger in his belly was real. The cold that would soon creep into their bones as night fell was real. And this box, this impossible, life-shattering box, was also real. A sob, thick and heavy, escaped her throat. A sound torn from the deepest part of her. A sound of grief and terror and a wild, terrifying hope all at once. She pulled him into her lap, burying her face in his hair, inhaling the simple, familiar scent of her child. Buster, sensing the storm of emotion, patted over and rested his heavy head on her knee, his warm presence a solid, comforting weight. For a long moment, they stayed like that, a strange tableau on the sagging porch of their broken castle. A mother, a son, and a dog clinging to each other as the world spun itself into a new and terrifying shape. The papers in her hand crackled, a stark reminder of the impossible truth. She was no longer just a homeless woman with $25 to her name. She was the guardian of a ghost's fortune, the keeper of a secret buried for decades. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her. If this was real, then the world was full of people who would want it. People with lawyers and power and the means to take it all away. They were vulnerable, exposed, two ghosts haunting an abandoned orchard with a treasure chest at their feet. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the orchard into a deep, velvety twilight. The air grew cooler, and Alara shivered, the thin fabric of her shirt offering little protection. "Okay," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Okay." She said it again, louder this time, a mantra against the rising panic. "Okay, Leo. We need to be smart. First, the chest. They couldn't leave it out here." It felt like leaving a mountain of gold on a city sidewalk. With a grunt of effort, she pushed herself to her feet, her legs unsteady. "Help me, sweetie. We need to put this back for now." Together, they pushed and dragged the heavy metal box off the porch and back toward the hole Buster had dug. It felt wrong to be reburying it, to hide this miracle away in the dark earth, but it felt even more wrong to leave it exposed. They lowered it back into its earthy tomb, the metal scraping against stone and root. Alara took one last look at the faded silk ribbons and the heavy wax seals before closing the lid. They shoveled the dirt back in with their hands, patting it down, trying to make it look as undisturbed as possible. She sent Leo to find some of the fallen leaves, and they scattered them over the spot, a flimsy, pathetic camouflage that was the best they could do. When they were finished, the spot was nearly invisible in the gathering gloom. But Alara knew it was there. She could feel it, a low, powerful hum of energy radiating up from the ground. a silent testament to the secret it held. Now the house. The car was out of gas and offered no real shelter. This ruin, their ruin, was the only option. "Come on," she said, taking Leo's hand. "Let's go inside our new house." The front door hung ajar, a dark, gaping mouth. Pushing it open, they were met with a wave of cool, musty air, the scent of dust, damp, and decay. The interior was even more daunting than the outside. In the faint, silvery light of the rising moon filtering through the grimy, shattered windows, they could see the ghostly shapes of furniture draped in white cloths, like sleeping giants. The floor was a minefield of fallen plaster, broken glass, and the debris of decades of neglect. A grand staircase, its banister thick with cobwebs, swept upwards into the oppressive darkness of the second floor. It was a place that had not known human life for a very long time. Buster went in first, his nails clicking softly on the patches of bare wood floor, his nose twitching as he took in the symphony of new smells. Leo clung to Alara's leg, his initial excitement about their castle, replaced by a more primal fear of the dark and the unknown. "It's spooky, Mom. It's just old, baby," Alara said, her voice more confident than she felt. "It just needs us to wake it up." They found what must have been the living room. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, a dark, cavernous maw. A sofa and two armchairs, their shapes softened by their white shrouds, were arranged around a low, dust-coated table. Alara walked over to the nearest armchair and pulled off the cloth. A cloud of dust billowed into the air, making them both cough. The fabric beneath was faded and worn, but intact. It was a real chair, a solid place to sit that wasn't the cracked vinyl of their car seat. Felt like the height of luxury. They spent the next hour in a strange, dreamlike state, bringing in their meager possessions from the car, the bundled blankets, the half-empty bag of groceries, a single, precious water bottle. They laid their blankets out on the floor in front of the fireplace, creating a small island of familiarity in the vast, strange room. Buster immediately curled up on the edge of the blankets, his body a warm, furry barrier against the encroaching shadows. For dinner, they shared the last of the crackers and a can of cold beans, a pathetic feast in a room that had probably once hosted grand dinners. But as they ate, a strange sense of peace began to settle over Alara. They were out of the car. They had four walls around them, a roof, however leaky, over their heads. And buried just a few feet away was a secret that could change everything. After they ate, Leo, exhausted by the day's emotional roller coaster, fell asleep almost instantly, his small body curled up beside Buster. Alara lay down next to him, but sleep was a distant country she could not reach. Her mind was a whirlwind, a chaotic storm of thoughts and fears and possibilities. $15.5 million. The number echoed in her head, a relentless, deafening drumbeat. What did that even mean? It meant a house, a real house, with plumbing that worked and a roof that didn't leak. It meant food, mountains of it, fresh fruit and warm bread and anything Leo's heart desired. It meant clothes that fit, a bed with clean sheets, a doctor if he got sick. It meant safety, security, a future. But it also meant danger. The papers were old, from the 1970s and earlier. Were they still valid? Who was the Blackwood family? What had happened to them? And how could she, a woman with no resources, no connections, and a $25 receipt for a ruined estate, possibly hope to claim any of it? She imagined walking into a lawyer's office, her clothes worn, her hair unwashed, and pulling out a stack of dusty, dirt-stained papers. They would laugh at her. They would think she was crazy. Or worse, they would see her desperation and take advantage of it, cheating her out of everything. The house groaned around her, the ancient wood settling, the wind whistling through the broken panes of glass. Every sound was magnified in the darkness, every shadow a potential threat. She thought about the county clerk, his initial amusement turning to disbelief. He knew the property was worthless. He had no idea what he had signed away for the price of a cheap dinner. What if he started thinking about it, got curious, came snooping around? Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the haze of her exhaustion. She was alone in this, utterly alone. She sat up, her heart pounding. The moonlight streamed through a tall, arched window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, silent stars. She looked at Leo's sleeping face, so peaceful, so innocent. He was dreaming, his lips curved into a small smile. He was dreaming a child's dreams of playgrounds and puppies and castles. He didn't know that their world had fractured, that they were balanced on the knife's edge of a new reality. A fierce, primal wave of protectiveness washed over her. She would not let him down. She had gotten them this far on sheer grit and a mother's desperate love. She would find a way to navigate this new, treacherous landscape. She would be smart. She would be careful. She would not let this impossible miracle be stolen from them. The first step, she realized, was not to panic. The first step was not to run to the nearest lawyer. The first step was to make this place a home, to create a space where they could be safe, where they could think, where they could plan. The fortune in the ground could wait. It had waited for decades, it could wait a little longer. What couldn't wait was them. They needed to eat. They needed to be clean. They needed to feel human again. With a new sense of purpose, she got to her feet. She couldn't sleep, so she would work. She found a splintered piece of wood to use as a makeshift broom and began to sweep a small area of the floor. The rhythmic scrape, 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 a soothing, meditative sound in the vast silence of the house. She was not just clearing away the dust and debris of the past. She was clearing a space for their future. She swept until a patch of the beautiful, inlaid wood floor was revealed, the intricate pattern of the grain a testament to the craftsmanship of a bygone era. She used a corner of one of their blankets, dampened with a precious splash of water, to wipe down the surface of the low table in front of the sofa. She took the single, perfect apple she had saved from the orchard and placed it in the center of the newly cleaned table. It was a small, simple act, but it felt momentous. It was an act of defiance against the decay, an act of hope in the face of despair. It was a claim. This is our home now. The first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the trees when she finally lay down again, her body aching with a clean, honest exhaustion. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach, but it was no longer all-consuming. It was tempered now by a sliver of something else, something that felt fragile and new and incredibly precious. Hope. As she drifted off to sleep, the image of the apple, red and perfect in the center of the clean table, filled her mind. It was a promise of sweetness, of life, of a harvest that was yet to come. The sun was high in the sky when she awoke, casting bright, dusty shafts of light through the living room. Leo was still asleep, his arm thrown over Buster's broad, furry back. For a moment, Alara lay there, disoriented, the strange, high ceilings and the unfamiliar shapes of the shrouded furniture confusing her. Then it all came rushing back, the car, the orchard, the clerk, the chest, the $15.5 million. She sat up, her heart beginning to pound again, and her eyes immediately went to the spot on the porch where they had reburied the box. It was still there, undisturbed. It was real. She took a deep breath, calming the frantic flutter in her chest. One step at a time. Today the plan was simple. Survive. And maybe, just maybe, begin to live. She looked around the room, at the piles of debris, the layers of dust, the ghostly white sheets. It was overwhelming. But then her gaze fell on the apple on the table, a single spot of vibrant color in the monochrome decay. It was a starting point. "Okay, Leo," she whispered to her sleeping son. "Today we make our castle clean." She would start with one room, this room. She would pull off all the sheets, beat the dust out of them, and wash them in the stream she'd heard gurgling at the edge of the property. She would sweep and scrub the floors. She would try to pry open one of the massive windows to let in the fresh, apple-scented air. She would pick more of the fruit from the orchard, a whole basketful this time. They would not be hungry today. It was a simple plan, a domestic plan, a plan that had nothing to do with lawyers or stock certificates or fortunes. It was a plan about creating order from chaos, about making a home. And as she stood there, In the dusty, sunlit living room of the shattered house she had bought for $25, it felt like the most important plan in the world. It was the only way she could begin to grasp the enormity of what had happened, by grounding herself in the small, tangible tasks of living. The money was an earthquake that had shattered the foundations of her world. Now she had to pick through the rubble piece by piece and start to rebuild. The work was a bomb, a physical anchor in a sea of terrifying abstraction. Elara began by tackling the shrouds, pulling the great white cloths from the furniture. Each one released a ghost of dust that danced and swirled in the sunbeams, a blizzard of forgotten years. She carried them outside, her arms full of the heavy, musty fabric, and with Leo's help, they beat them against the trunk of a massive oak tree. Leo, laughing with delight, treated it as a game, swinging a fallen branch with all his might, sending up fresh clouds of dust with every blow. Buster, caught up in the excitement, barked and chased the swirling motes as if they were a flock of strange, gray birds. The rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack echoed through the quiet orchard, a sound of reclamation, of life returning to a place that had been silent for too long. Afterward, they took the sheets down to the stream she had heard. It was a clear, cold ribbon of water that tumbled over smooth, mossy stones at the far edge of the property. The water was shockingly cold, stealing her breath as she waded in, but it felt cleansing, real. They submerged the great cloths, the water turning murky with the dirt of decades. They scrubbed them against the rocks, their hands growing numb, the sun warm on their backs. They laughed as a small frog, disturbed from its home, leaped from a fold in the fabric and plopped back into the water. They were not just washing sheets, they were washing away the grime of the road, the stink of the car, the feeling of being lost and dirty. When they were done, they spread the damp cloths over the low branches of the apple trees, a line of white flags signaling their surrender to this new life. Back in the house, the living room felt transformed. The furniture, now unshrouded, revealed its true character. The sofa and armchairs were upholstered in a deep burgundy velvet, faded and worn in places, but still elegant. The wood of the tables was dark and rich, inlaid with intricate patterns. With her makeshift broom, Elara swept the floor, her movements sure and steady. She was not just a homeless woman anymore. She was the mistress of a house, tending to her domain. Leo, armed with a damp rag, diligently wiped down the legs of the chairs, his small face a mask of concentration. By late afternoon, the room was clean. The floor shone, the furniture was free of its dusty coat, and the air, drifting in through the now propped, open door, smelled of sunshine and apples instead of decay. They brought in more of their blankets and arranged them neatly on the sofa. It was a home, their home. The next few days fell into a simple, comforting rhythm. Mornings were for work, for exploring their new domain. They discovered a small, overgrown vegetable patch behind the house, where a few stubborn tomato plants still bore small, sweet fruit. They found a hand, pump well with a heavy iron handle, and after much straining and groaning, they managed to draw up clear, cold water. It tasted of iron and earth, the sweetest water Elara had ever known. Afternoons were for gathering apples, which became the staple of their diet. They ate them raw, they roasted them in the great stone fireplace until they were soft and bubbling, and Elara, using a shard of glass she had carefully cleaned, peeled them into long strips that they dried on the porch railings. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, and Elara would tell Leo stories, tales of brave knights and enchanted castles that felt real within the stone walls of their own ruin. For the first time in months, Leo's laughter was full and easy, and the haunted, weary look had begun to fade from his eyes. The $15.5 million buried under the porch felt like a dream, a story as fantastical as the ones she told her son. Her reality was the weight of the water bucket in her hand, the sweet juice of an apple on her tongue, the warmth of her sleeping child beside her. It was enough. The sound came on the fourth day, a low, unfamiliar hum that grew steadily into the purr of an expensive engine. It was a sound that did not belong in their quiet, forgotten world. Elara, who was on the porch mending a tear in Leo's shirt with a needle and thread she had found in a dusty sewing box, froze. Buster, who had been dozing in a patch of sun, lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Leo stopped his game of chasing a grasshopper and ran to his mother's side. Through the tangled screen of the apple trees, they saw it, a sleek black car, polished to a mirror shine, crawling slowly up the overgrown lane. It was a predator, silent and deadly, invading their sanctuary. The car stopped where the path to the house began, and a man emerged from the driver's side. He was tall and thin, dressed in a suit so sharp and dark it seemed to absorb the sunlight. His shoes were polished, his hair was perfectly coiffed, and he moved with an air of impatient, condescending grace. He looked at the house, his lip curling in a faint, disdainful sneer, as if he had just stepped in something unpleasant. He walked toward them, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel of the path. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps, his eyes flicking over Alara's worn clothes, her bare feet, the makeshift domesticity of their setup. His gaze was cold, assessing, and utterly dismissive. Well, he said, his voice smooth and cultured, but with an undercurrent of steel. Looks like someone's made themselves at home. Alara's hand tightened on Leo's shoulder. She didn't speak, her throat suddenly tight and dry. I am Arthur Vance, he announced, as if the name itself should mean something to her. I represent a consortium of investors who have an interest in this property. He gestured vaguely at the house and the orchard. We've been trying to acquire this parcel for some time. It's an eyesore, a public nuisance, frankly. The plan is to clear it, of course. Make way for a new development. He gave her a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. I understand your situation. Times are tough. People do what they have to do to get by. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a slim leather wallet, from which he extracted a small stack of crisp bills. I am authorized to offer you a relocation assistance fee, let's say $500, for your trouble. You gather your things and you're gone by morning. No fuss, no bother. We bring in the bulldozers next week. $500. The words hung in the air between them. A week ago that sum would have been a miracle, a lifeline. Now it was an insult. It was a dismissal of her existence, of her right to be here. He was trying to buy her off, to sweep her away like so much inconvenient trash. A fire, hot and fierce, ignited in Alara's chest. It burned away the fear, the intimidation. She thought of the deed in her pocket, the flimsy piece of paper that said this was hers. She thought of the chest buried in the earth, the legacy of a forgotten family. She thought of her son, and the future that had been stolen from them, and the future that had been miraculously, impossibly returned. She stood up, pulling Leo behind her, her body forming a shield in front of him. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and steady, imbued with a strength she didn't know she possessed. We're not leaving. Vance's smile faltered. He blinked, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. I'm sorry. I said we're not leaving, she repeated, her chin lifting. You can't bulldoze this house. It's not for sale. A flicker of genuine surprise, quickly followed by annoyance, crossed his face. He let out a short, humorless laugh. Ma'am, I think you're confused. This property is a ward of the state, tied up in tax liens and probate for 30 years. It's effectively abandoned. You're a squatter. You have no rights here. The word squatter stung, but Alara held her ground. She walked back into the house, her heart hammering against her ribs, and retrieved the folded, worn document from the pocket of her jeans. She walked back out onto the porch and held it out to him. I'm not a squatter, she said, her voice shaking slightly, but her resolve firm. I'm the owner. I bought it 4 days ago, from the county clerk's office. Vance stared at the paper in her hand as if it were a snake. He didn't take it. He squinted, his eyes scanning the official letterhead, the signature, the $25 fee clearly noted. A slow, dark flush crept up his neck. The condescending amusement in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fury. He looked from the paper to her face, and for the first time, he seemed to truly see her, not as a piece of pathetic debris, but as an obstacle. A tax deed, he spat, the words dripping with contempt. You paid $25 for a worthless piece of paper. Do you have any idea who my clients are? Do you have any idea how long they have been working to consolidate this land? We have prior claims, liens, a team of lawyers who will bury you in litigation until you and your child are begging on the street again. The threat was no longer veiled. It was naked and brutal. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing hiss. You have no idea what you've stumbled into. This is not some fairy tale, lady. This is business. And you are getting in the way of a multi-million-dollar project. That is a very dangerous place to be. He held her gaze for a long, terrifying moment, his eyes promising a world of trouble. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and stalked back to his car. The engine roared to life, and the black car disappeared back down the lane, leaving a cloud of dust and a profound, ringing silence in its wake. Alara stood on the porch, the deed clutched in her trembling hand, the $500 he had dropped on the steps fluttering in the sudden breeze. The fragile piece of their new life had been shattered. The dream of the fortune was no longer a distant fantasy. It was a target, and they were standing right in the middle of it. The battle for the orchard had just begun. The silence that descended in the car's wake was heavier, more menacing, than any that had come before. It was a silence filled with the echo of Vance's threat, a void where the fragile piece of the last few days had been. Alara's knuckles were white where she gripped the splintered porch railing, the deed a crumpled, sweaty mess in her other hand. The $500, a small fortune just last week, lay scattered at her feet like dead leaves, a testament to the man's casual cruelty. He had not just threatened her, he had tried to erase her, to reduce her claim, her home, her very existence, to a minor nuisance that could be bought off and swept away. Leo pressed against her side, his small body trembling. Is that bad man coming back, Mom? Alara looked down at him, at the fear that had returned to his eyes, and the fire in her chest solidified into something hard and unyielding. It was one thing to be homeless and hungry, a victim of circumstance. It was another to be hunted. No, baby, she said, her voice a low, fierce promise. I won't let him. She knelt and gathered the crisp bills, smoothing them out with methodical care. This wasn't just money anymore, it was ammunition. It was the first volley in a war she hadn't asked for but would not run from. She tucked the bills into her pocket alongside the deed. They would need a lawyer. They would need food that didn't grow on trees. They would need gasoline for the car, not to run away, but to fight back. The first step, however, was knowledge. Vance had power and money, but she had the truth, buried in the dirt and written on faded paper. She needed to understand what it meant. That evening, as the fire crackled in the great stone hearth, she did not tell Leo a story. Instead, she carefully unrolled the documents from the chest, which she had retrieved from its hiding place the moment Vance's car was out of sight. The risk of leaving it buried felt greater now than the risk of discovery. With Leo and Buster asleep beside her, she spread the papers across the clean, dark wood of the floor, the firelight flickering over the elegant, archaic script. There were deeds for parcels of land all over the county, stock certificates for long, defunct companies, and the leather-bound ledgers filled with meticulous records. At the very bottom of the chest, she found one more item, a thick, sealed envelope made of heavy parchment, addressed simply to my executor. With trembling fingers, she broke the wax seal. Inside was not a legal document, but a letter written in a flowing, feminine hand. It was dated 1979, the same year as the financial summary. To whomever finds this, it began. If you are reading this, then I, Eleanor Blackwood, am long gone, and the world has failed in its duty to remember. This house, this orchard, was meant to be a sanctuary, a place of sustenance for the community, a legacy of my family's belief that wealth is a responsibility, not a privilege. We fed this town through the Great Depression. We provided work when there was none. This land is soaked in that intention. Alara's breath caught in her throat. The words resonated with a power that the legal jargon of the deeds lacked. This was the heart of the treasure. I am the last of my line, the letter continued. I have no heirs of my blood, and I have seen the circling vultures, the men in their sharp suits who see this land not as a living orchard, but as a grid of profitable lots. They speak of progress, but they mean erasure. I have tried to establish a legal trust to protect it, but they have fought me at every turn, tangling my wishes in a web of legal challenges I fear will outlive me. And so, I have taken this final, desperate step. I have liquidated what I could, converted my family's legacy into these bearer bonds and deeds. A dragon's hoard to be hidden from those who would misuse it. It is my hope that one day, someone with a heart aligned to the purpose of this land will unearth it. The law may have failed me, but I have placed my faith in the soil and in the goodness of a stranger. The letter ended with a final, haunting plea. Do not let the vultures win. Use this wealth to make the orchard live again. Let the trees bear fruit for everyone. Let this house be a shelter for those in need. This is the Blackwood legacy. This is my final will. Tears streamed down Alara's face, hot and silent. She was not a squatter, not a thief. She was the chosen stranger. She was Eleanor Blackwood's last hope. The weight of this responsibility was heavier, more terrifying, than the $15.5 million. This was never about the money. It was about a promise. The next morning, she left Leo with Buster, a solemn little man guarding his castle, and walked the miles into town. The county clerk's office was just as she remembered it, dusty and quiet. The clerk, whose nameplate read George Henderson, looked up from his crossword puzzle, his expression shifting from boredom to recognition, and then to a wary curiosity. You again, he stated, not unkindly. Don't tell me you want a refund. Alara laid the $500 on the counter. I need help, she said simply, and I can pay for your time. George Henderson stared at the money, then at her face. He saw the desperation was gone, replaced by a hard, clear resolve. He pushed the money back toward her. I don't take bribes, he said gruffly, but I am a public servant. What's the trouble? Alara told him everything. She told him about Vance, the threats, the consortium. She told him about the chest, the deeds, and finally, about Eleanor Blackwood's letter. As she spoke, George's expression changed. The weary indifference melted away, replaced by a flicker of anger, and then a deep, sorrowful recognition. Eleanor Blackwood, he said softly, the name an old memory. I was just a boy, but I remember her, a grand old lady. My father used to say the Blackwoods practically built this town. And Vance? He spat the name like something foul. His group has been buying up distressed properties for years. They promise jobs, then build exclusive developments that price everyone out. They're poison. He stood up, a new energy in his movements. You've kicked a hornet's nest, ma'am, but you might have just kicked it in the right direction. He disappeared into a back room filled with towering shelves of bound volumes and returned a few minutes later, blowing a thick layer of dust off a massive ledger. Let's see what the official record has to say about Miss Eleanor's final wishes. For the next 2 days, George became her unlikely ally. He dug through decades of property records, probate filings, and court dockets. He made quiet phone calls to other clerks in neighboring counties, to old friends in the town's historical society. A picture began to emerge, a story of a powerful investment group systematically dismantling the region's history for profit, and of an old woman's fierce, but ultimately failed, legal battle to stop them. The trust she had tried to create had been successfully challenged and dissolved by Vance's lawyers after her death, citing a lack of a clear beneficiary. They had been clever, patient, and ruthless, but they had not counted on the treasure chest. They had not counted on Alara. The news spread through the small town like wildfire. George, it turned out, was not just a clerk. He was the town's unofficial historian and its most prolific gossip. The story of the homeless woman, her son, and their dog, who had bought the old Blackwood place and were now standing up to the developers, became a local legend overnight. People who had once looked at her with suspicion now saw her as a symbol of their own anxieties about the town's future. On the third day, as Alara and Leo were harvesting apples, a pickup truck rumbled up the lane. A burly farmer with a weathered face got out, holding 2 large paper bags. "Heard you were living on apples," he said without preamble. "Figured you could use a change." He handed her the bags, one filled with fresh vegetables from his garden, the other with bread and cheese. "George told me what you're doing. The Blackwood orchard fed my family when my granddad was out of work. It's good to see someone fighting for it." He was the first of many. A retired teacher brought books for Leo. The local hardware store owner dropped off tools, lanterns, and a new, sturdy lock for the front door. A woman from the church brought warm blankets and a hot casserole that filled the old house with the scent of home. They were no longer alone. They had a community, an army, standing with them. Vance returned a week after his first visit, just as Eleanor's letter had predicted. This time he was not alone. He brought a sheriff's deputy and a lawyer who carried a briefcase full of legal documents. They found Alara on the porch, but she was not alone either. The farmer was there, and the teacher and George Henderson, and a dozen other townspeople, standing silently on the lawn, their arms crossed, their faces grim. "This is a formal notice of eviction," Vance's lawyer announced, his voice loud and officious. "This property was improperly sold due to a clerical error. My client's prior lien takes precedence. You have 48 hours to vacate." "A clerical error?" George Henderson stepped forward, his voice booming with indignation. "I am that clerk, and I can assure you the sale was perfectly legal. What's not legal is the way your client has preyed on this town for a decade." The lawyer smirked. "Sentimental stories won't stand up in court. We have the law on our side." "Do you?" Alara's voice cut through the tension, clear and steady. She held up Eleanor Blackwood's letter. "Or do you just have the most expensive lawyers? This isn't just a property dispute. This is the execution of a last will and testament. A will that your client deliberately ignored." She handed the letter to the sheriff's deputy, a young man who looked deeply uncomfortable. He read it, his eyes widening. He read it again, then looked at Vance, a new, hard expression on his face. "Furthermore," Alara continued, her confidence growing as she spoke, "the assets described in that will, which were hidden to protect them from you, have been recovered. All $15.5 million of them." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Vance's face went pale, the blood draining from it, leaving his skin a pasty, mottled gray. The lawyer's jaw dropped. They had known about the land, but they had never known about the hidden fortune. It changed the entire equation. "These assets," Alara announced, her voice ringing with the authority of her purpose, "will be used to enact Eleanor Blackwood's final wish. We will be establishing the Blackwood Community Trust. A pro bono lawyer from this town is already filing the paperwork. The orchard will be restored. This house will become a shelter, a place for families who, like mine, have fallen on hard times. This land will once again serve the people of this community." Vance stared at her, his mask of sophisticated power shattered, revealing the greedy, hollow man beneath. He saw not a homeless woman, but the embodiment of a legacy he could not defeat. He saw the faces of the townspeople united against him. He saw his multi-million-dollar development turning to dust. Without a word, he turned and walked back to his car, his lawyer scurrying behind him. This time they did not look back. The cheer that went up from the small crowd was deafening. The farmer clapped Alara on the back, and the teacher hugged her, tears in her eyes. In that moment, standing on the porch of her $25 house, surrounded by her new community, Alara felt richer than any number on a page could ever make her. 1 year later, the orchard was a symphony of life. The gnarled old trees had been pruned and tended, and new saplings stood in neat, hopeful rows. The house, no longer a skeleton, was fully restored, its windows gleaming, its porch solid and welcoming. It was no longer just a house, it was Eleanor's place, a vibrant community center, and a temporary home for two families who were getting back on their feet. A harvest festival was in full swing on the lawn. The air was filled with the scent of apple pies baking in the new industrial kitchen, the sound of children's laughter, and the music of a local band. Alara, no longer in worn, thin clothes but in simple, practical jeans and a clean shirt, moved through the crowd, a confident and beloved leader. She oversaw the distribution of free produce, she coordinated volunteers, she listened to the stories of her neighbors. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the celebration, she found her way back to the porch. Leo, his face no longer smudged with dirt but sticky with caramel apple, ran up and threw his arms around her legs. Buster, his tail thumping a happy, steady rhythm against the porch steps, rested his head on her knee. She looked out at the thriving orchard, at the families sharing food, at the lights twinkling on in the restored house. It was the dream they had whispered in the dark, made real not just for themselves, but for everyone. The rusted metal had screamed, and the earth had given up its secret, not just a fortune in paper, but a forgotten promise that had finally, after so long, been kept.